It doesn't matter how ancient or modern we become. It doesn't matter how intelligent the individuals talking about the issue may be. Creation speaks, and it speaks about God. We're going to do truth in 10-ish, in 3, 2, 1. For a long time, it perplexed me that the Bible doesn't seem to spend a whole lot of energy trying to prove God's existence. The preferred approach of Scripture is to simply assert the existence of God with very little justification. And it starts in the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. An assertion. It's not an attempt at proof. The closest Scripture actually comes to giving a justification for God's existence is something along the lines of, look at the creation around you, it's obvious. And maybe that's why Genesis 1:1 says no more, because creation is mentioned, and therefore God did it. That's the explanation. End of story. That's the biblical logic over and over again. And of course, in a modern world, people say, come on, it just isn't that simple. It's not that is such a simplistic way to look at things, but bear with me. Is it? Let's have a look. Let's look at one example, Psalm 19, and it says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." It's a paradox, isn't it? There's no speech, there's no words, the voice is not heard, but on the other hand, creation proclaims and declares and speaks and reveals. You don't hear anything audible, and yet you are spoken to. And I believe everybody sees this, whether or not they can articulate it. And when we're out in the wilderness and we look up at a night sky away from light pollution, we can't look away. There's a sense of wonder. There's a voice that is heard. There's a witness in the sky. And the voice is so strong that it has provoked human beings ever since the beginning to seek an explanation for what it is that they are seeing. From those who believe that it is speaking to them from itself and worship it, through to those who have asked ultimate philosophical questions in response to looking at it. Questions like, where did it come from? How is there something rather than nothing? How is it ordered and beautiful? What does it all mean? Scripture's consistent. This voice which is not heard, but is heard from the created reality all around us, is telling us only one thing, and it's declared again in Romans chapter 1. For what can be known about God is plain to people, because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. And there it is, the theme of the Bible on this subject: plain, clear, without excuse. I think we can summarize and say it's saying it's obvious. This voice and this declaration, this proclamation, this revelation, to use all the words that Psalm 19 used, that comes from creation makes God's existence obvious. And I understand again, we live in an age when people say, well, that's dumb ignorance, it's unsophisticated. If we know one thing, we just know that it isn't that simple. Well, let's take a little dabble in history for a second, a few examples. I'm going to go back for the first one, 2,500 years, to the 5th century BC. A man called Thales, a philosopher. And he knew a few things that we also know. He knew that something cannot come from nothing. So he wondered where things came from when he looked at the created world around him. He knew that order and unity don't come from disorder and chaos, and the order and the unity of the universe was puzzling to him. So what's holding it together? What's the thing that's there at the center of it? But he also knew that objects at rest remain at rest unless acted on by an outside force, the law of inertia. But all that Thales saw in creation was movement. Planets were moving, Plants were growing, people were walking, clouds were rolling by, rain was falling, wind was blowing, tectonic plates shift, time itself moves on. Movement is all we have, nothing stops. And so Thales asked a question. He said, well, I wonder what moved first? Who moved? He concluded that it must be something that's in everything, because it's moving everything. It must be something that can move all by itself, that has power in itself without outside input. And it must be something that's always been here to build and animate things from the beginning. So he needs two things, if you think about it. He needs something that's basically eternal and something that's basically powerful. And he has a bright idea. He says, I know what it is. It's water. Rivers flow, tides come in and go out, waves crash, oceans swell, it moves with mighty power, all by itself. And also, it's in everything because every life, he realized, needs water. But also it can be liquid, solid, or gas, and everything's a liquid, solid, or a gas, so it's everywhere. And so he thought he had his bright idea. Here's my eternal source of power. But another guy, Anaximenes, comes along and says, no. It's not water, mate. It's air. Wind currents and breezes. Look at them. Mighty power by themselves. No one's pushing them. And surely it's been here from the beginning, and it's in our very breath. And then this sort of thinking went on for a while, and what did we get? Wind, fire, water, earth. The four basic elements that underpin all reality. But if you've got four, you don't have one anymore. And so they all start to go, well, hang on, whoops, we've made a mistake. We need the one. What's the one behind the four? And another guy, Anaximander, comes along and says, well, whatever it is, and he described it this way. He said it is boundless and ageless. That is to say, it must be infinitely powerful and eternal. Now, people say, oh, look, Martyn, what do those philosophers know? Way back in the Dark Ages, going back in time a bit far when people knew nothing. Well, you know, all the questions we ask today were asked by the ancient Greeks. And there's many inquiries in our day with more fancy names and wearing new clothes, but they are the same basic question. Look to something like the grand unifying theory. It looks at what we now know, that there are four basic forces responsible for all the pushes and pulls in the universe. The electromagnetic forces, gravity, and the weak and strong nuclear forces. And what do they say? What's it saying? It's saying, you know what? I wonder what the actual fundamental force is. What's the power behind the power? Where did it come from? What was it from the beginning? It's the same question. I mentioned 4 weeks ago, I once heard an interview with one of the scientists working on the Large Hadron Collider project in Switzerland, which is a very recent thing. And he was talking about their work on the radio. And he got into the nuts and bolts a bit with the interviewer, and he started to talk about why this sort of thing was being done. And he explained that they're trying to solve two basic problems. One, what existed before the Big Bang? And two, what infused the Big Bang with its power? What was already there at the beginning? And what was powerful? I can hear Thales from beyond the grave saying, what moved? Who moved? It's the same question. And he went on to describe the crucial role that their research was going to play in answering this question. And he said it was wrapped up in a particle, a subatomic particle called the Higgs boson. And he said it's called the Higgs boson technically, but we call it the God particle. You see something? He is saying this particle, whatever it is a bit like God. It's got God qualities. So what God qualities? Well, it's boundless and ageless in a sense. It was there at the start, and it's got power. It's got the qualities we're looking for, the eternal and the powerful. You know, it doesn't matter how ancient or modern we become. It doesn't matter how intelligent the individuals talking about the issue may be. Creation speaks. It declares and it proclaims. And it speaks about God. It doesn't matter whether it's Thales or Stephen Hawking. The basic questions are the same in new clothes, expressed in bigger words. What's making it all move? Where's the power? How did it all start? What's the beginning? What's powerful? What's eternal? We'll listen again to the simplistic and scornful words in our age of Romans chapter 1. What can be known about God is plain to people because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Eternity, power. That's where creation points us, says the scriptures. And so it does. And so it always has. But people don't want to accept the obvious answer to what is eternal and what is powerful. Because they sit there and they say, well, it's a God particle. And they accept the eternal power bit to some degree, but they don't accept the divine nature bit. They don't say, no, it's not a God particle. It's an actual divine God. And see, those are the two possible answers. It's something like a particle, or it is something like, well, the actual divine God. One of those answers is the obvious answer, because you might find the particle, but what gave the particle its power? What started the particle? What was before the particle? What was before water and air? What was before? Every one of these inquiries doesn't answer the question. And we know what Thales knew. Order doesn't come from chaos. Something doesn't come from nothing. Scripture is a word for every generation. And this simple insight of Scripture is applicable in every generation, and the inquiries that are had in every generation. That's the beauty of it. We said about answers in Genesis. When you look at Genesis and find the blueprints, they're the blueprints for every generation. The questions actually change, but the blueprints are always in Genesis. When the Scripture comes along and says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't matter whether it's Thales or Stephen Hawking or a farmer working late who looks up at the stars. That word should come to us in such a way that we go, oh, of course, that's the missing piece. God. And many people in the world will say, we're very dumb for thinking like that. I just want to say, no, they are being dumb. They are avoiding the obvious answer to which creation speaks. I recall walking on a deserted beach on a remote island in Australia, off the coast. Lots of empty places in Australia. And I hadn't seen a soul for a week until I stumbled upon a chair made out of driftwood and fishing line, neatly perched on a rock, facing a glorious view, in the middle of nowhere. What was my question? Who did this? And where are they? If driftwood and fishing line is a voice and a declaration and a revelation to me then of someone on a deserted beach, how much more does a rose or a star or a human eye speak of a God with eternal power who put it there? In the beginning, that's the eternal. God created, that's the power, the heavens and the earth. It's a statement of the obvious. And it doesn't matter who's pondering the question, from a philosopher to somebody out on a deserted beach. That is our moment of revelation. That's our eureka moment. All that remains is for us to find out who this God is and what this God has done.